He's spent over 25 years helping the world reconnect with nature, from shaping the Paris Climate Agreement to leading the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration to now driving corporate climate action as Climate Action Vice President at Salesforce. He's a diplomat, he's a strategist, a farmer, and a visionary who believes humanity is in a relationship crisis with nature and that by rebuilding that bond, we can unlock a future of abundance, balance, and beauty. Today, we explore what it means to treat ecosystems as infrastructure, how nature can help us solve the climate crisis, and how each of us can join the global movement to restore the planet. Please welcome Tim Christophersen to Rise and Thrive Conversations for Greatness.
Hi, John. It's great to meet you.
Thank you for getting up so early. So Rise and Thrivers, it's 6 o'clock in the morning in Denmark, and just shows Tim's commitment to the cause. And you know, Tim, that Australians have a bit of a connection with Denmark.
Yes, I do. And we're all very grateful for that connection.
We love, well, I was going to say Princess Mary, but she's Queen Mary now, right?
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And actually, this is not in the book, but the royals across Europe, of course, set a lot of the tone of our relationship with nature, all the way back to the French court and this idea of dominion over nature, where the sort of the close-cut lawn comes from. That was then copied everywhere. You know, people just copy what they see from the royal courts, and that actually still goes to today. So I'm very happy that some of the royal houses in Europe and also in the UK, they start to have a different relationship with nature.
Nice. And Queen Mary, she's from Tasmania, and they've got a history, the Tasmanians, of being very climate and nature focused. So let's hope she's bringing that to the royal court over there. And I know you've talked about growing up in a small village in Germany and exploring the forests with your grandfather. And I'm just wondering how those early experiences shaped your worldview and how that memory kind of influences the way you think about nature today.
I grew up in a small village in a very rural setting in Australia, you might say, in the outback, I don't know, somewhere far off the beaten path. And there was really not much to do but spend a lot of time in nature and explore forest, village, spend a lot of time fishing and camping and hiking. And because I thought that was how kids grow up, because when you're a kid, you assume that everybody lives like that. But it's, of course, not really the norm, especially not anymore today. First of all, because there's less nature, but also because we are now seeing kids are what is called the indoor generation. You know, there's a lot of time spent on screens and inside. So when I grew up, I had a lot of direct interaction with the natural world. I think that shaped my love for nature that I've carried with me ever since. But there were two big changes in how I perceived nature. When I was a kid, I had this almost intuitive relationship with nature of being able to see how nature was doing and how an ecosystem was thriving by all the connections between the species. And I had this feeling of the level of energy in an ecosystem. And then later I studied ecology and forestry at university. And that's, of course, thoroughly driven out of you when everything is replaced by metric units, scientific names of plants and animals, the monetary value of standing timber. So you walk around the forest, you only see bits and pieces. You don't see the whole, and you don't see the web of ecology. So that was one of the things I rediscovered later in my career, that awe and inspiration I got from nature as a child. And I think that's the kind of ecological literacy that we all need to rediscover, and that we all know, and that we all have experienced at some point or another. And if not, it's hardwired in our DNA, because we co-evolved with nature for all of human existence. So we have this biophilia in all of us.
Yeah, great. Nice way to put it. I'm constantly telling my children that we're not separate from nature. So even when there's a bug in the house or something, I say, well, we are all, you know, in this together. And I do know when personally I'm in nature, you do have this more feeling of aliveness and expansion than you do when you're surrounded by concrete, that's for sure.
Yeah, when I speak with people living in cities, they often have this feeling that nature is something out there, far away. Something you have to get in your car to drive to. But well, first of all, cities can be some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet because of all the different plants we brought into our cities. But also they are great habitats for birds and often insects. And there are uh, varying degrees of green spaces in cities, of course. The more green space, the more the mental health of people, the well-being, and also often the economy prospers. So we have clearly to learn how to bring nature closer to us, but nature is always with us. I think your analogy of being in a house and nature is everywhere is the right one, because it's the mind shift we need is not that nature is out there somewhere for us to rediscover, but that we are part of nature. Actually, even with our buildings, our cities, our technology, and this separation from nature that is programmed in our philosophical autopilot that the Western world at least seems to be on, comes from around 300 years ago, from the era of enlightenment, when we were taught that only humans are divine. The rest of creation is just an intricate machine. That's just put here for us to use up and eat and burn and liquefy, and it's a commodity.
Yep.
That was what René Descartes and the other Enlightenment philosophers, I don't like the term Enlightenment, as you can hear, for that philosophical concept, but that's what they taught, and that is still with us. Nobody's questioning that. So when you look up in the Oxford Dictionary the definition of nature, it says it's the phenomena of the physical world collectively as opposed to humans. As opposed to humans. So it's not even just that we're separate from nature. They say it's something completely different.
Yeah, yeah.
And as long as we have that day-to-day language understanding of nature, I think we're not going to repair this relationship crisis that we're in.
Yeah, well, that leads us to me wanting to ask you about your book. So, your book, Generation Restoration, you do describe that relationship crisis with nature. Could you unpack that a little more, what you mean and what that means for us as individuals and for the planet?
I certainly can, and also can show you a copy of the book. Here it is. So Generation Restoration is lucky enough to have a foreword by Jane Goodall, who, of course, sadly passed away a few weeks ago. So this is one of the last things she published, is the foreword to the book. If you would imagine that you're in a human relationship with nature, I think we would be headed for divorce at this point, because it's an abusive relationship. It's a relationship where we only take. We take. There's almost nothing left to give. And you can't be in a relationship like that. I don't know if, some of us maybe have, or some of us are. And this doesn't work. It becomes toxic. And at some point, it has to end one way or another. And that's the relationship crisis I mean. So I mean that quite literal. We're in an abusive relationship with nature. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, actually calls it our suicidal war with nature. It's a war we cannot win, because we are at war with ourselves if we are at war with nature. So that relationship crisis is something very real, and it's an underlying cause for many of the symptoms we see, whether it's pollution, whether it's climate change, whether it's biodiversity loss. So the reason I wrote the book is to ask some of the bigger questions. Why are we in this current problematic state of civilization where things are unsustainable? There's the word sustainability has many definitions, but it's easier to define what is unsustainable. Unsustainable means you cannot sustain it. It cannot be sustained over a long period of time. And that's the situation we're in. So the first chapter of the book is taking stock of this mess that we're in, and I call it the 10% world. We've dropped to a probably below 10% of the natural wealth we once had and the natural richness. We've lost 73% of all wildlife populations since the 1970s.
Wow.
And if you would weigh all the mammals on planet Earth, 4% of the weight of mammals are wildlife. The rest are humans and livestock. So we've basically pushed the natural world to the brink. More than half of coral reefs have bleached already. And scientists now say, this is very recent, it's been a study to say that they've probably gone over the ecological tipping point of global coral bleaching. So the first chapter of the book is bleak, but then it gets more optimistic and hopeful. As the title indicates, I'm not here to talk about all the things that are wrong, but to paint a new vision for what relationship humanity should have with nature so that both of us can thrive and we can thrive together. Humans living in harmony with nature.
Yeah, well, I hadn't really thought about the concept of ecosystems should be treated as infrastructure, just like roads or energy grids or water systems. So I'm really interested on that reframing, and I can hear why it's so powerful. It is that's what's needed to shift governments and companies how to act, that shift in framing.
I think it's one of the shifts that will help. If you imagine, for example, the world's mangroves, Australia has some mangroves, but they are actually only about 1% of global forests are mangroves. But they have an outsized importance for protection of coastal ecosystems. In a lot of areas, they protect coastal communities from storm surges.
Yep.
They're also the hatching and nursery ground for a lot of commercial fish species that spend the rest of their lives in the ocean, but they basically spend the first few days or weeks of their lives in mangroves. So when we have mangroves, we have healthy fisheries, we have well-protected communities, we have very well-functioning carbon sinks to stabilize the climate, we have ecosystems that produce a lot of food. When we don't have those mangroves, we expose our communities to storms. We lose probably a third of all commercially fished species in the ocean. We lose a lot of the carbon that is stored. So what else is that but infrastructure? I think it's more than infrastructure, because there's also spiritual well-being linked to many ecosystems. Of course, there are intrinsic values to ecosystems. But if you see it as infrastructure, I think we've come to the point where we can no longer take that infrastructure for granted. And we have to reinvest in that infrastructure and rebuild it. I'll give you one other example. The country of Sri Lanka exports a lot of tea. It's a relatively small country, and there's one central mountain shed across the whole country. And the tea is grown around that mountain, and on the top of the mountain shed is a watershed that is forested and that provides the water for the tea plantations. Most of that forest has disappeared, which means now there's no more filtration and storage of groundwater that is then released slowly to the tea plantations. So they cannot grow enough tea anymore, which is one of the main export products of the country. So once you get to that level of understanding of what nature does for you, of course, you want to take up a big World Bank loan. You want to maybe lend $500 million or so and repair that infrastructure like you would repair or build an airport or a 4-lane highway. But we've not understood nature in that sense, because for most of our existence, it was just always there. Nature is just always there. But we've come to the point now where that natural capital bank account is overdrawn. It's in the red. So our checks are starting to bounce. Even in the global economy, food supply chains become unstable. The price of cocoa, for example, I don't know if you like chocolate, but I do, and many people do, I think, has gone up 4 times in the last 4 years. It spiked a few months ago at about $10,000 a ton for raw cocoa. So that's a sign that those supply chains are faltering because ecosystems becoming unstable. Climate change has caused a lot of bad harvests in West Africa. Cocoa plantations have to shift. We will see more and more of this happening unless we repair the relationship crisis with nature. We see nature as critical infrastructure for everything. Well, for everything we eat, for everything we drink, but also for everything we build, for everything we trade, for everything we need for our mental health, for our well-being. And we are not used to seeing nature like that, just like we're not used to seeing things that we take for granted like that. We're a bit like kids who take their parents for granted and, everything that they provide and all that they do every day.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they grow up or one of the parents is sick or they both are disappearing and then suddenly you wake up and say, well, this is really no longer working. I have to do something. That's the situation that we're in.
Yeah, it's really great perspective to look at it and reframe it to really understand. Like I think we understand it's important, but that reframing I think hits it home even more. And you've had time at the UNEP, which is the United Nations Environment Program, and with corporate initiatives, and you've seen private investment grow and becoming like a serious asset class. Now that's shifted, hasn't it? So when we're talking about needing to repair the ecosystem, it's that kind of funding that's going to make a real difference. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, it's going to make a very big difference, not the whole difference. And I'll get to that in a second, what the whole difference we need is. But on the positive side, private sector investments in nature have gone up about 11-fold just in the last 4 years. So UNEP Finance Initiative has measured that there's now about 109 billion US dollars invested of private capital in nature per year. Which I think is about 10% of what we need. We need around about $1 trillion per year, which is about 1% of global GDP reinvested in nature. So it's not a large amount. And the other thing we need to do urgently is to stop putting taxpayer money into things that make the situation worse,
Right.
like fossil fuel subsidies. That urgently has to stop because it's really robbing us of our future. It's destabilizing the climate even further. It's further causing nature loss. So reshifting some of those harmful subsidies, and that is all also in the UNEP, the UN Environment Program's report series called The State of Nature Finance, which my team started when I worked there. When we shift those harmful subsidies and we put taxpayer money to better use, we can quickly get to that level of investment. It's actually not a very big deal. But we have to change that mindset of seeing nature as a free lunch that lasts forever to something critical infrastructure that we have to reinvest in. And fortunately, of many of these private investment funds that are coming up, they have now been able to, with the help of UNEP and others, to define nature as an asset class. That sounds very technical, but it's very important because when your pension fund or your bank wants to invest money, they need to know what are the risks of an asset like real estate, what are the rewards, what are the pricing mechanisms, and that wasn't really clear for nature-based solutions or investments in nature restoration until recently, and now that's much clearer. So basically, nature is now open for business in the sense of restoration investments in conservation, and that hasn't been the case until very recently.
Yeah, right. I think most of us understand in terms of tourism, especially in places like Australia, that it is a valuable asset and can drive investment because it's revenue generating. But I would imagine, and I hear what you were saying earlier about those subsidies, it would really help if they weren't there and subsidising things that are harming the environment. But I also know there's the nature of governments can be a little bit short-sighted. And if I've got a lobby group giving me money to get me re-elected into next term, I could see how that would happen, and so there's not going to be any energy given to, for want of a lack of a better expression, there's not going to be any energy given to reducing those subsidies because I'm the government. I'm getting lobbied and funded by these people to get me re-elected. So I know it's very short term, but I'm just wondering, what can we do about that? Because I don't have a lot of experience in that area, but I can't see a way out of that just because of the human nature.
Well, I'm glad you asked because that's the reason why I wrote the book. We have the knowledge and the tools and the science, and as you just said, we even have the money. What we need is called political will, and that is in itself a renewable resource, as Al Gore keeps reminding us. For example, it can be generated by people expressing their opinion and their preferences, and when we all express our preference that we don't want the Great Barrier Reef to go the way of the dodo, to just completely bleach and stop being a tourist attraction, which it very well might in the next few decades. When people say that and that they prefer that over open pit coal mining in Australia and other forms of value generation, then politicians listen. Of course, the fossil fuel lobby in particular is very powerful and is paying a lot of political campaigns. There are estimates that there's about $200 million spent per year lobbying and spreading disinformation about climate change, for example, from fossil fuel backed lobby organizations. But I think we have more agency as people who want a clean and healthy and green future that includes a healthy relationship with nature, that includes existing and healthy forest ecosystems and mangroves and coral reefs and mountain ecosystems and wetlands. So I believe this fact that we are part of nature is going to play out in our favor, because as nature is under threat, that which will save it is also rising, which is us, because we are part of nature. And as we realize that what is under threat here is us, we will rise to nature's defense. So my last job at UNEP was to set up the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, which we're still in. It's the decade 2021 to 2030. And yes, we coined this hashtag generation restoration for the UN decade. So it's not only the title of my book. And if you go on Instagram right now, you'll find about 140,000 mentions of that hashtag, of people everywhere, especially young people, reconnecting with nature and making their voice heard. So we need more of that. And we need not only the young people, because they're not the people in power yet. They will be at some point, but at that stage it might be too late. We need people our age who actually have something to say and have political clout to step up. So this is an intergenerational task. Again, that's the title of the book and of the hashtag, to express this is not a problem for Gen Z or Gen Alpha or millennials or Gen X in my case. It's for all of us. We're all generation restoration. And once we make our voice heard, we're the strongest lobby group in the world. There's nothing that can stop that sort of reinvestment and understanding that we need nature. Yeah. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Well, and I was wondering what your vision or what you think would be if we were truly living a regenerative relationship with nature. What would that really look like? And I know we've got the decade of ecosystem restoration, which you mentioned, which ends around 2030. What about after that? If we get it right, what are we looking at?
So there's also a personal element to the book. We bought a farm about 5 years ago, a dairy farm here in Denmark, and we're restoring that. I can talk a little bit more about that later, what we're doing to be on that personal journey to restore our relationship with the land and shift to a permaculture and regenerative agriculture with agroforestry and rotating sheep grazing. And there's a lot to learn, I think, for all of us, what regenerative agriculture, for example, really means. But what I would like to say on sort of at a global scale, what that regenerative relationship with nature really looks like is, I think, that we can learn a lot from indigenous peoples and from local communities, traditional systems in agriculture, for example, because that relationship still exists in many places of the world. Hasn't disappeared, and it even exists in societies that are otherwise what we call highly developed. So Japan has this system called Satoyama, which means these are landscapes where humans and nature live in harmony. They are agricultural landscapes that have high biodiversity, that have high stability of ecosystem outputs. And likewise, there are many of those examples around the world, often found in indigenous communities. And my favorite project in that sense, well, there's many great projects, but the largest scale project that builds on that reciprocity with nature and indigenous wisdom is called Acción Andina. It's a project to restore all of the high Andes from Venezuela to Patagonia. It's now only started 6 years ago, but there are now 40,000 people volunteering their time in areas sort of above 4,000 meters to restore the forests of the Andes, which have all but disappeared. 90% of them have disappeared over the last centuries. And that movement, it's more of a social movement building on the spirit of reciprocity and regenerating that relationship with nature, is more powerful than seeing this only in economic terms, because it would be very difficult to pay 40,000 people to go and plant trees. They've planted over 15 million trees in 400 locations. They do it because they want to rebuild that reciprocity with the mountain ecosystem that they live in. For water, for example, they don't have forests and the glaciers are disappearing. They don't have forests capturing that moisture and storing it in wetlands. There's no water for the downstream areas, including for cities like Lima. So that reciprocity is something that we can learn, we must learn from indigenous wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, indigenous cultures around the world have been living in harmony with nature and respected. I know our Australian Indigenous are an example of that. I think you've answered one of the questions I was going to ask you about, for listeners who aren't in positions of major influences, what are some of the concrete actions we can do to meaningfully make a difference? So you've set a great example there in the Andes. Have you got any others?
Yeah, when we talked about the big money that is needed for nature worldwide and $1 trillion, and that sounds like large sums. Breaking it down to more of a day-to-day level, I think there's something even more important than money that we need to fix. And I'll describe that in a way when I'm asked often, what is the business case for nature? And I've been answering that to businesses and governments for 25 years, so I can make a financial business case. But to me, it still sounds like somebody comes to me and asks, so you have a family, what's the business case for being a good father or a good husband? And I'm like, well, I'm sure there is one, it's probably it's probably good for your health, and then your kids will probably come and visit you more often when you're old if you're nice to them. So, there's a business case, but at another point, that's also irrelevant because it's just the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that relationship with nature is just the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And the importance here for everyday people.
Thanks for joining us on Rise and Thrive Conversations for Greatness with John Merkus. Remember, you are loved, you are worthy, and you do matter. Embrace the journey of personal growth and motivation. Let's go out there and do something great. Follow or subscribe for more insights and inspiration every Tuesday. Until next time, stay awesome.